August 6, 1945. Tinian Island in the Northern Mariana Islands, 3,000 kilometers south of Tokyo. It is just past 2 in the morning, and the tropical air is thick and warm even in darkness. On a runway lit by floodlights, a B-29 Superfortress sits waiting, its aluminium skin gleaming under the arc lamps. Ground crew move around it with the quiet, deliberate efficiency of men who know they are part of something they do not fully understand. Painted on the nose, almost gently, is a woman's name, Enola Gay, after the mother of the pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets. Inside the bomb bay hangs a single weapon, nicknamed Little Boy. It weighs around 4,400 kilograms, roughly the mass of a fully loaded delivery lorry, yet it carries a destructive potential that no single object in human history has ever matched before it. Armourers have spent the night attaching it, checking it, rechecking it. Few of the men on the runway know precisely what is inside the smooth metal casing. Fewer still understand the physics that will unfold when it strikes its target. Tibbets climbs into the cockpit. Around him sit 11 other men, most of them unaware, until minutes before takeoff, of what their aircraft actually carries. The engines cough into life, one after another, and the noise rolls across the airfield like distant thunder. At 2:45 in the morning, Enola Gay lumbers down the runway, so heavily laden with fuel and payload that witnesses on the ground hold their breath as it struggles to gain altitude, wheels skimming perilously close to the dark water beyond the tarmac. For 6 hours, the aircraft climbs steadily towards Japan, tracking northwest across the Pacific in near silence, the crew running through checklists with the mechanical calm of men who have rehearsed this mission more times than they can count. They do not yet know if the weapon will work. Nobody does, not with absolute certainty. There has been only one previous test, weeks earlier in the desert of New Mexico, and that test used a different design entirely. What is about to happen over the city of Hiroshima will not simply end a war. It will open an entirely new chapter in the history of warfare, of science, and of what humanity is capable of doing to itself. This is the story of the Manhattan Project, the secret alliance of scientists, soldiers, and engineers who built the first atomic weapon, and of the mission that carried it, for the first time, into the sky above a living city. By the summer of 1945, the Second World War had already claimed an almost incomprehensible number of lives. In the Pacific theater alone, American forces had spent nearly 4 years fighting their way from island to island, absorbing horrific casualties at Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where combined losses on both sides exceeded 100,000 men in a matter of weeks. Japan showed no sign of surrender. Its military leadership had prepared for a final defense of the home islands, an operation the Allies had codenamed Downfall, which planners estimated could cost anywhere between several 100,000 and over 1 million Allied casualties, alongside a similarly staggering toll among Japanese civilians and soldiers. Conventional bombing had already devastated Japan's cities. In March 1945, a single night of incendiary raids on Tokyo killed an estimated 100,000 people and left much of the capital in ashes, using nothing more exotic than napalm and high explosive dropped from hundreds of aircraft. And still the war continued. The existing tools of destruction, however terrible, required enormous fleets, repeated missions, and months of sustained effort to achieve results that remained, in strategic terms, indecisive. American commanders and planners had watched the fighting on Okinawa with particular horror. The battle there, fought between April and June 1945, had produced fanatical resistance, mass civilian casualties, and a wave of kamikaze attacks that sank or damaged well over 300 Allied vessels. If the defense of a single, relatively small island could exact such a price, the prospect of invading the Japanese home islands themselves, defended by a population primed for total resistance, filled war planners with genuine dread. Some Japanese officials spoke openly of mobilizing civilians, including schoolchildren, to fight with sharpened bamboo spears if necessary. Whether such resistance would truly have materialized on the scale feared remains debated, but the intelligence available to Allied commanders in mid-1945 painted a grim and uncertain picture. What the Allied leadership wanted was something that did not yet exist: a single weapon, delivered by a single aircraft, capable of destroying an entire city outright. The theoretical foundation for such a weapon had existed since the late 1930s, when physicists including Otto Hahn, Lise Meitner, and Enrico Fermi demonstrated that the nucleus of a uranium atom could be split, releasing a disproportionate quantity of energy in the process. In August 1939, Albert Einstein and Leo Szilard wrote to President Roosevelt warning that Nazi Germany might already be pursuing such a weapon. The warning triggered a research effort that grew, over 6 years, into the largest and most secretive industrial project the world had ever seen. The scale of the challenge was staggering. Building a working atomic weapon required not just theoretical physics but an entirely new industrial base: facilities to enrich uranium, reactors to produce plutonium, laboratories to design a functioning bomb, and a security apparatus to keep the entire enterprise hidden from both enemies and allies alike. No nation had ever attempted anything of comparable scale in complete secrecy. The scientific hurdles alone seemed nearly impossible to clear within the time frame available, and yet the war would not wait. The organization tasked with solving this problem was the Manhattan Engineer District, known simply as the Manhattan Project, led by Major General Leslie Groves and directed scientifically by the physicist Robert Oppenheimer at a purpose-built laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. At its peak, the project employed more than 130,000 people across dozens of sites, though the overwhelming majority had no idea what they were actually building. Workers at the vast enrichment facility in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and the plutonium production complex at Hanford, Washington, operated machinery whose true purpose was known only to a handful of senior figures. 2 entirely different bomb designs were pursued simultaneously, because nobody could be certain which would work. The first, Little Boy, used highly enriched uranium-235 in what scientists called a gun-type design, in which one mass of uranium was fired down a tube into a second mass, the resulting collision creating a critical mass sufficient to sustain an explosive chain reaction. It was considered mechanically simple enough that its designers were confident it would function without a live test, which is precisely why it was never tested before use. The second design, used in the weapon nicknamed Fat Man, relied on plutonium-239 and a far more complex implosion method, in which conventional explosives arranged around a plutonium core compressed it inward with extraordinary precision and symmetry, triggering the chain reaction from within. This design was considered so uncertain that it demanded a full test, and on July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert near Alamogordo, that test, codenamed Trinity, produced a fireball with a force equivalent to roughly 20,000 tons of TNT, a flash of light visible from over 160 kilometers away, and a mushroom cloud that climbed higher than 12 kilometers into the desert sky. Observers who had spent years calculating the theoretical yield on paper watched the actual detonation in stunned, frightened silence. The physicist, Kenneth Bainbridge, who directed the Trinity test, reportedly turned to Oppenheimer immediately afterwards and remarked simply that they were all now sons of a certain unmentionable word, a comment that captured, in a single, blunt sentence, the mixture of triumph and horror felt by many of the scientists present. President Harry Truman, then attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, received word of the successful test in a coded telegram describing a baby that had been born, healthy and strong. The news transformed the diplomatic atmosphere at Potsdam almost immediately, though Truman gave only the vaguest hint to Soviet leader Joseph Stalin that the United States now possessed a weapon of unusual destructive force, a hint Stalin reportedly received with far less surprise than Truman had expected, given how thoroughly Soviet intelligence had already penetrated the Manhattan Project. Little Boy itself measured roughly 3 meters in length and around 70 centimeters in diameter, a shape not unlike an elongated oil drum with tail fins attached. Assembling its uranium components required material that had taken the Oak Ridge facility, sprawling across tens of thousands of acres, the better part of 2 years to produce in usable quantity, using enormous banks of electromagnetic and gaseous diffusion equipment that consumed more electricity than entire American cities. The exact production figures for enriched uranium during the war remain, even today, incompletely documented in open sources, though historians agree the process yielded barely enough material for a single weapon by the summer of 1945. The bomb was flown in pieces to Tinian aboard the cruiser USS Indianapolis in late July, a voyage completed just days before the ship was torpedoed on its return journey, resulting in one of the worst losses of life in United States naval history. On the island, technicians assembled the final weapon inside a specially air-conditioned hut, working with a combination of extreme caution and total secrecy, aware that a single mistake could kill everyone in the building. Tinian itself had been transformed in a matter of months into one of the busiest air bases on the planet, home to hundreds of B-29 bombers and tens of thousands of ground personnel. Yet the unit assigned to deliver the new weapon, the 509th Composite Group, operated in near total isolation from the rest of the base. Its air crews trained relentlessly, flying practice missions using dummy bombs shaped and weighted to match the real thing, while its members were forbidden from discussing their work even with other airmen stationed only meters away. Colonel Tibbets, who had personally selected and trained the crew, was among the very few men on the island who understood the full nature of the weapon they were preparing to use. Security around the assembly hut was extraordinary even by wartime standards, with armed guards, restricted access, and a compartmentalized chain of command designed so that no single individual, outside the most senior figures, held the complete picture of what was being built. If you're finding this story as extraordinary as I do, a quick subscribe genuinely helps more than you'd think and costs you nothing at all. At 8:15 in the morning, local time, Enola Gay released Little Boy from an altitude of roughly 9.5 kilometers above Hiroshima. The bomb fell for 43 seconds before detonating approximately 600 meters above the city, close to its intended aiming point, the distinctive T-shaped Aioi Bridge. The detonation released an explosive force equivalent to somewhere between 13 and 18,000 tons of TNT, though the precise figure has been debated by historians and physicists for decades, given the difficulty of reconstructing exact yield data from a single wartime event. The effects on the city were catastrophic and, in the words of many survivors, almost impossible to describe. Buildings within a radius of roughly 1.5 kilometers from the hypocenter were flattened outright by the blast wave. A firestorm subsequently swept through the wreckage, consuming what the initial explosion had not already destroyed. Estimates of the immediate death toll vary considerably, from tens of thousands killed instantly to a broader figure, including deaths from injuries and radiation sickness in the following months, that many historians place at around 140,000 people by the end of that year alone. Precise numbers remain, and likely always will remain, impossible to establish with certainty, given the chaos of the moment and the destruction of civic records alongside the city itself. Crew members aboard Enola Gay, watching from a distance after banking sharply away from the target, described a light brighter than anything they had witnessed before, followed by a shockwave that struck the aircraft with physical force even many kilometers from the point of detonation. The tail gunner, Robert Caron, later described the mushroom cloud boiling upward beneath them as unlike anything he had ever seen, a column of fire and smoke that seemed to have a strange, terrible life of its own. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second aircraft, Boxcar, dropped the plutonium implosion weapon, Fat Man, on the city of Nagasaki, after poor visibility forced a diversion from the original target of Kokura. Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945, formally signed aboard USS Missouri on September 2nd, bringing the Second World War to its conclusion. Germany, despite the fears that had originally triggered the Manhattan Project, never came close to producing a working atomic weapon. The German nuclear program, hampered by resource shortages, competing research priorities, and, according to some historians, fundamental miscalculations in the physics of achieving a sustained chain reaction, never advanced beyond small-scale experimental reactors. By the time Allied forces overran German nuclear facilities in 1945, researchers there remained years behind their American counterparts, a gap later confirmed when captured German scientists, held at Farm Hall in England, were secretly recorded expressing genuine shock upon hearing the news of Hiroshima on the radio, having believed such a weapon remained a distant theoretical possibility rather than an operational reality. The Soviet Union, by contrast, had been closely monitoring the Manhattan Project through an extensive network of espionage and successfully tested its own atomic weapon, a plutonium implosion design closely modeled on the American original in August 1949, considerably earlier than most Western analysts had predicted. This achievement effectively ended America's brief monopoly on nuclear weapons and set the stage for the decades-long arms race that would come to define the Cold War, an era in which the destructive principles first proven at Trinity and Hiroshima were refined, multiplied, and eventually surpassed many times over by thermonuclear weapons of vastly greater yield. The historical impact of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains, even 8 decades later, a subject of serious and unresolved debate among historians. Some argue the bombings were the decisive factor in Japan's surrender, sparing the enormous casualties that a land invasion would almost certainly have produced. Others point to the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan on August 8, just 2 days after Hiroshima, as an equally or more significant factor in the Japanese leadership's decision, given internal records suggesting some military leaders were more alarmed by Soviet entry than by the bombings themselves. What is not disputed is the scale of human suffering inflicted, nor the permanence of the change the weapon brought to global politics. Nuclear deterrence became, almost overnight, the central organizing principle of international relations, a status it retains to this day. Survivors of the bombings, known in Japan as hibakusha, carried the physical and psychological consequences of that morning for the rest of their lives, and many faced decades of discrimination within Japanese society itself, rooted in public fear and misunderstanding of radiation sickness. Some hibakusha became powerful, lifelong advocates for nuclear disarmament, traveling the world to describe what they had witnessed as children or young adults, determined that no other city should ever suffer the same fate. Their testimony, alongside the physical evidence preserved at Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Museum, has become one of the most significant sources historians and the public alike draw upon in trying to understand the human reality behind the statistics. The technical legacy of the Manhattan Project extended, too, into fields far removed from weapons design. The techniques developed for uranium enrichment and reactor control laid the foundation for civilian nuclear power, which today generates a meaningful share of electricity across dozens of countries. The vast administrative and scientific apparatus built to manage the project also became a template for later government-funded scientific endeavors of enormous scale, from the space program to modern particle physics research, each inheriting something of the Manhattan Project's fusion of ambitious science, industrial capacity, and government secrecy. The Enola Gay itself survives, meticulously restored, and is now on public display at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, Stephen F. Udvar Hazy Center, near Washington Dulles Airport, where visitors can stand beneath its enormous wingspan and try, however imperfectly, to grasp the weight of what it once carried. In Hiroshima, the skeletal remains of the Genbaku Dome, one of the few structures left standing near the hypocenter, have been preserved exactly as they stood in the aftermath, now recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a permanent physical reminder of that August morning. Return for a moment to that runway on Tinian, in the darkness before dawn. a lorry-sized weapon built through 6 years of secret labor by more than 100,000 people who mostly never knew what they were building, lifted into a B-29 that could barely clear the water at the end of the strip. Behind that single object stood physicists who had first split an atom in a laboratory only years before, engineers who had built entire cities dedicated to enriching uranium and breeding plutonium, and a chain of command stretching from a desert test site in New Mexico to the Oval Office in Washington. What happened next changed the character of warfare permanently. Before Hiroshima, destroying a city required hundreds of bombers, thousands of tons of ordnance, and repeated missions across many nights. After Hiroshima, it required one aircraft, one bomb, and 43 seconds of falling time. That transformation, more than any single death toll or strategic argument, is the true and lasting legacy of the mission flown by Enola Gay. The scientists at Los Alamos had a phrase for what they were attempting, borrowed half-jokingly from Hindu scripture by Oppenheimer himself. They were, in his words, becoming death, the destroyer of worlds. Whatever judgment history ultimately renders on the decision to use the weapon, the technical achievement itself remains almost unfathomable, a secret alliance of science and industry that reshaped, in a matter of 6 years, humanity's entire